The late afternoon light came and slanted through the laundry room window, catching the dust in the air like something suspended, unwilling to fall. Maggie Ellison stood at the folding table, her hands moving through the familiar motion of matching sleeve to sleeve, corner to corner, the same rhythm she'd kept for 22 years in this house. It was a small task. It asked nothing of her. That was why she liked it. She almost didn't hear the phone at all. Vanessa's voice drifted from the hallway, low and clipped, the tone she used when she thought no one was listening. Maggie wasn't trying to listen either, not at first. A towel folded. A pillowcase folded. But something in the rhythm of her daughter-in-law's voice changed, tightened, and Maggie's hands slowed without her deciding they should. I know, just give it another few weeks. Once the paperwork clears, the house is basically ours. The towel stayed in Maggie's hands, half-folded, forgotten. Ours. She stood very still, the way she used to stand when Thomas would come in from the yard, and she could tell by his footsteps that something was wrong before he'd said a single word. 22 years of learning to read silence. She was reading it now. Vanessa's voice moved further down the hall, muffled by a closing door, and then there was nothing but the hum of the dryer and the settling creak of a house that had never once, in all its years, felt uncertain of who it belonged to. Maggie set the towel down. The house is basically ours. She thought of Thomas's handwriting on the deed, the ink gone slightly brown with age, the way he'd handed it to her the week before he died and said, "This is yours, Maggie, no matter what." She thought of the mortgage paid off 11 years ago, the party they'd thrown, cheap champagne in the good glasses. She thought of every quiet, unremarkable Tuesday she'd spent inside these walls, believing the one thing in her life that couldn't be taken from her was this. She didn't call out. She didn't ask Vanessa what she meant. She finished folding the towel instead, her movements careful now, deliberate, a woman rebuilding a wall one brick at a time. But the sentence stayed lodged somewhere behind her ribs, and it did not leave. What paperwork? Thomas Ellison had built the house with his own hands, or near enough. He'd hired help for the wiring and the roof, but the bones of it, the frame and the floors and the wide front porch he'd insisted on even when the budget said otherwise, those were his. Maggie remembered standing in the empty lot with him 22 years ago, nothing but cleared earth and a stack of blueprints held down against the wind by a coffee can, and Thomas saying, "This is where we grow old." She hadn't believed him, not entirely. Young couples said things like that. But he'd meant it the way he meant everything, quietly and completely. They raised Ryan within these walls. They painted the kitchen yellow and then, a decade later, a softer cream when yellow started to feel too loud. They buried a dog beneath the oak tree in the backyard and never told Ryan exactly where. Thomas fixed the gutters every October like a man keeping a promise to no one but himself, and Maggie learned the particular creak of the third porch step, so well she could avoid it in the dark without thinking. He died 3 years ago. A heart that gave out on an ordinary Sunday morning, no warning, no long goodbye. Just Thomas in his armchair with the newspaper still open on his lap, and Maggie calling his name twice before she understood. In the weeks after, when everything else in her life felt like it belonged to someone else, the grief counselor's careful questions, the casseroles left on the porch by neighbors who didn't know what else to offer, the house was the one thing that still felt like hers. Because it was. Thomas had made certain of that. The will was simple, notarized, unambiguous. The house, the land, all of it to Margaret Ellison, sole owner, no conditions attached. She'd kept the paperwork in the desk in what used to be his study, the drawer he'd always called the important things drawer, half joking, though he'd never once joked about what was actually inside it. For 3 years, that certainty had been enough. She didn't need the house to be grand. She needed it to be hers, proof that a life built slowly, honestly, over 22 years, could not simply be undone. Which was why the sentence from the hallway sat so wrong in her chest. Because nothing about that house had ever been paperwork waiting to clear. It had already cleared. Thomas had seen to that before he'd even said goodbye. It happened on a Sunday, which felt deliberate, though Maggie couldn't have said why that detail mattered so much except that Sundays had always been Thomas's day. Pancakes, the newspaper, the particular slowness of a morning with nowhere to be. Vanessa had asked her to sit at the kitchen table like it was an invitation, though the tone underneath it left no real room to decline. Ryan sat beside his wife, not across from his mother. Maggie noticed that before anything else. He kept his eyes on the grain of the wood table, tracing it with one finger the way he used to do as a boy when he knew he was in trouble and hadn't yet decided whether to confess. "We just think it's time we talked honestly," Vanessa began, folding her hands the way people do when they've rehearsed a thing and want it to look spontaneous. "About fairness." Maggie waited. "Ryan and I have been carrying a lot of the household costs lately. Groceries, the utilities when they spike in summer, all of it. And it's not that we mind helping. We love you, Maggie, you know that. But it doesn't seem right that you're not contributing anything toward the house itself." The house itself. As though it were a shared apartment. As though her name weren't the only one on the deed sitting 3 rooms away in a drawer Thomas had once called the important things. "I don't understand," Maggie said, keeping her voice level, though something in her chest had gone very still. "This is my house." "Of course it is," Vanessa said quickly, too quickly, a smile arriving a half-second behind the words. "No one's saying otherwise. But you live here too, and it's only fair you help cover what it costs to keep it running. We were thinking $1,200 a month. That's well below market rent. Honestly, we looked into it." Market rent. As though Maggie were a tenant in her own home. As though Thomas hadn't stood in this very kitchen 22 years ago and promised her a place that could never be taken. She looked at Ryan, waited for him to say something, anything, that this was absurd, that his mother owned the house outright, that the mortgage had been paid off 11 years before Vanessa had even entered their lives. He didn't look up from the table. "Ryan," Maggie said quietly. "It's not a bad idea, Mom," he said, still tracing the wood grain. "Just to help out. It's not that much." Not that much. Maggie thought of her fixed income, the modest pension, the careful budget she kept in a notebook by the phone. Vanessa, meanwhile, wore a new bracelet Maggie hadn't seen before, gold and delicate, catching the kitchen light. She said she'd think about it. She did not say yes. Helen Ruiz had lived next door for 11 years, long enough that she and Maggie had developed the kind of friendship that didn't require phone calls to arrange. Just the sight of a porch light on, or a wave across the low hedge that separated their yards. It was over that hedge, 2 days after the Sunday conversation, that Maggie finally said it out loud. "She wants $1,200 a month. To live in my own house." Helen set down the mug of coffee she'd been holding and gave Maggie a look that had nothing gentle in it. "She wants what?" Maggie repeated herself, quieter this time, as though saying it a second time might make it sound less absurd, and instead it only sounded worse. "That doesn't track," Helen said, shaking her head slowly. "I remember Vanessa at the wedding. For years ago, wasn't it? She seemed sweet. A little quiet, maybe, but sweet. This isn't that." "People change," Maggie offered, though even she didn't quite believe it. "People don't change into landlords overnight," Helen said. "Something's going on with her, Maggie. I've heard things." She hesitated, the way people do when they're deciding whether a piece of gossip is worth repeating. "Carol, from the property office downtown. You remember Carol? She mentioned Vanessa's been in there. Twice. Asking questions about property law. Ownership transfers, that kind of thing." Maggie felt something cold settle low in her stomach. Why would she need to know that? "I don't know," Helen said. "But I don't like it. And I don't like that Ryan just sat there and let her ask you for rent money like it was nothing." Maggie didn't have an answer for that either. She'd tried calling Ryan twice since the Sunday conversation. Once to ask, gently, if he really believed what Vanessa had said, and once just to hear his voice, to remind herself that underneath all of this was still her son, the boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat of the car with his face turned toward her. Both calls had gone to voicemail. He'd texted back the second time, "Busy at work, talk later, love you." He hadn't called back. "Ask him directly," Helen said. "Don't let Vanessa be the only voice in the room. He's still your son, Maggie. Make him answer you." Maggie nodded, though the thought sat uneasily in her chest, tangled up with something she didn't want to name yet, the growing, quiet suspicion that her son wasn't avoiding an argument. He was avoiding a choice. She told herself she was only looking for a photograph. The one of Thomas standing in front of the half-built frame of the house, hard hat pushed back on his head, grinning like a man who didn't yet know how good his life was about to be. She wanted to hold it. Some days, that was reason enough to open the study door. The study still smelled faintly of him, or she liked to believe it did. Cedar and old paper. The particular must of a room that hadn't changed in 3 years because she hadn't been able to bring herself to change it. His desk sat exactly where he'd left it, dark wood scarred with the small dents of a life lived at it, and Maggie ran her hand along the top drawer out of habit before reaching for the lower one. The important things drawer. The key was where it had always been, tucked behind a chipped mug of pens on the shelf above, and Maggie fitted it into the lock the way she had dozens of times before. To find the deed, the will, the old insurance papers Thomas had organized with a precision that used to make her laugh. It didn't turn. She frowned and tried again, jiggling it the way old locks sometimes required. But the resistance wasn't the resistance of rust or stiffness. It was wrong. The mechanism caught at an angle that told her, with a small cold certainty, that someone had already forced this drawer open once, and in relocking it, hadn't quite managed to seat it the way it used to sit. Her hands were not steady now. She worked the key more carefully, and after a moment it gave, the drawer sliding open with a faint scrape it had never made before. The deed was there. She exhaled at that, some tension leaving her shoulders. But the folder beside it, the one that had always held the notarized copies of Thomas's will, the ones he'd insisted on keeping duplicated just in case, he'd said, though he'd never explained in case of what, was thinner than she remembered. She lifted it, flipped through the contents with fingers that had gone unsteady in a different way now. One copy of the will was missing. She sat very still in Thomas's old chair, the leather worn into the shape of a man who no longer sat in it, and looked at the empty space in the folder where a document should have been. She thought of the scratches near the lock, faint but real once she knew to look for them. She thought of who had been in this house in the past few months, who had access, who might have had a reason to want a spare copy of a will that named, in plain and unambiguous language, exactly one owner of this house. She did not have proof of anything yet, but she no longer believed, sitting in that chair, that the overheard sentence in the hallway had been a misunderstanding. 8 months before that afternoon in the study, Maggie had fallen on the back porch steps. The third one, the one that creaked, the one she knew so well she'd stopped watching her feet on it. A patch of ice she hadn't seen. One moment she was reaching for the railing, and the next she was on the ground, her hips screaming, the gray morning sky tilting strangely overhead. She remembered fragments after that. The ambulance's ceiling, fluorescent and too bright. A nurse asking her name 3 times as though the answer might change. The particular haze of the pain medication they'd given her, warm and thick, pulling the edges of the room soft and indistinct. Ryan had come. She remembered that clearly, at least, his face above hers, pale with worry, his hand finding hers on top of the hospital blanket. She remembered feeling grateful for that hand. She remembered thinking, even through the fog, that whatever else was uncertain in the world, her son was here. Vanessa had come too. Maggie hadn't thought much of it at the time. Why would she have? A daughter-in-law visiting a woman recovering from surgery. It seemed, if anything, like kindness. Vanessa had sat by the bed with a folder of papers, her voice soft and practical in a way that had felt, in the moment, almost soothing. "Just a few things for the insurance," Vanessa had said, laying a pen in Maggie's hand, guiding her fingers gently toward the page. "So the hospital bills go through properly. You don't want to be stuck dealing with paperwork once you're home, do you?" Maggie remembered the weight of the pen. She remembered the medication making the lines on the page swim faintly if she looked too long, the words blurring at the edges no matter how she blinked. She remembered Vanessa's finger, gentle, pointing to a line near the bottom. "Just sign here, Maggie." That's all. She had signed. She remembered the scratch of the pen, the strange looseness in her own hand, Vanessa's voice saying, "Good, perfect. That's all we need," in the same tone someone might use to soothe a frightened child. She remembered feeling relieved to be done with it, whatever it was, so she could close her eyes again. She had never asked to see the document again. Why would she have? Vanessa had said insurance. Ryan had been standing right there, hadn't he? Or had he stepped out for coffee by then? Maggie tried now, in the study, 8 months later, to pull the memory into sharper focus, and found she couldn't. The fog of that day had never fully lifted from that particular hour. It was the one gap in an otherwise ordinary recovery, a blank space she'd never had reason to examine. Until now. Sitting at Thomas's desk with an empty folder in her lap, Maggie felt the first real chill of understanding settle over her. Not proof, not yet, but the shape of a question she couldn't unthink. What exactly did I sign that day? And beneath it, quieter, worse. Why did it have to be while I couldn't read it clearly? She had never agreed to pay it. That was the detail Maggie kept returning to in the days after the Sunday conversation. She'd said, "I'll think about it," not yes, and in her mind those two things were not the same at all. So when the first of the month came and went without a check changing hands, she assumed, perhaps naively, that the matter had quietly settled itself the way uncomfortable family conversations sometimes did, dissolving under the weight of everyone's mutual desire not to revisit them. Vanessa did not let it dissolve. She showed up on a Thursday evening, no warning, standing on the porch with her arms crossed and an expression Maggie hadn't seen from her before. Not the careful softness of the kitchen table conversation, but something harder, more impatient, a woman done pretending the request had ever been optional. "You said you'd think about it," Vanessa said, before Maggie had even fully opened the door. "I did think about it," Maggie said. "And I don't believe I owe rent on a house I own outright." Something shifted in Vanessa's face, brief, controlled, but Maggie caught it. "It's not that simple anymore, Maggie. There are things you don't fully understand about the arrangement. Legal standing isn't always as clear-cut as people assume, especially not after." She stopped herself, just short of finishing the sentence, and Maggie felt the missing words land harder than any she might have said. "After what?" "After everything," Vanessa said, too quickly, the door already closing on the thought. "Look, I'm trying to keep this friendly. But there are people involved now who won't be as patient as I am." "What people?" Vanessa's mouth tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You'll understand soon enough. I'd just hate for this to get more complicated than it needs to be." She left without another word, her heels sharp against the porch boards, and Maggie stood in the doorway a long time after the car pulled away, turning the conversation over in her mind and finding no comfortable place to set it down. Legal standing. People involved. Words meant, she suspected, to frighten rather than inform, and they had worked, whether Vanessa intended precision or not. 2 days later, Maggie returned from the grocery store to find her key no longer fit the side door off the kitchen. The one she used most, the one nearest the driveway. She tried it twice, 3 times, before understanding settled over her with the particular coldness of a fact that could not be argued with. The lock had been changed. Not the front door, not yet. Just this one, quiet and unannounced, as though someone were testing how much she would notice, and how much she would tolerate noticing. She stood on her own porch, bags of groceries growing heavy in her hands, and felt something inside her that had been patient for 3 years finally begin quietly to run out. She did not call Ryan that night. She did not call Vanessa either. She called Arthur Kessler's office instead. The number still saved in her phone from Thomas's estate, untouched for 3 years, and left a message asking, as calmly as she could manage, whether he had time to see her. Ryan hadn't expected to be served anything. He'd come home from work the way he did most Tuesdays, tie loosened, mind already halfway to dinner, when a man in a plain jacket met him at the end of the driveway and asked, with a politeness that made the moment feel almost unreal, if he was Ryan Ellison. He'd said yes before he understood what he was agreeing to. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. He stood in the driveway reading it twice before the words arranged themselves into something he could actually process. A petition, filed in the county court, requesting the appointment of a legal guardian to manage the affairs of Margaret Ellison, on the grounds that she was, the document said, in careful clinical language, no longer fully capable of managing her personal and financial affairs independently. His mother's name. His mother's competence, laid out in bureaucratic phrasing as though it were a fact already settled rather than an accusation still to be proven. The petitioner listed was Vanessa Ellison. Ryan read the name 3 times, the way a person reads something hoping repetition might change it. It didn't. Beneath the petitioner's name, in the section outlining supporting evidence, was a reference to a hospitalization 8 months prior, a documented incident involving diminished capacity and impaired decision-making following injury, cited as grounds to suggest a pattern of vulnerability. He remembered that hospitalization. He remembered his mother's hand in his, her voice slurred from medication, and Vanessa sitting quietly beside the bed with a folder of papers he'd assumed, at the time, was nothing more than insurance forms. He found Vanessa in the kitchen when he got inside, setting the table as though it were any other Tuesday, and he set the papers down in front of her without a word. She looked at them, then at him, and something in her face rearranged itself too slowly to be genuine surprise. "You filed this," Ryan said. "Not a question. Ryan, you filed a guardianship petition against my mother, using her hospital stay, the one where I was standing right next to her bed." "I did it for her," Vanessa said, her voice gaining the smooth, rehearsed quality he'd heard once before, at the kitchen table, the day of the rent conversation. "She's not managing things well on her own, Ryan. You've seen it. The forgetfulness, She fell on ice," Ryan said. "That's not forgetfulness. That's ice. It's more complicated than." "Is it?" His voice came out sharper than he meant it to, sharper than he usually allowed himself around Vanessa, and he watched something flicker behind her eyes at the sound of it. Not guilt, he thought, but recalculation, the look of someone realizing an approach wasn't landing the way she'd planned. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty simple. You want the house. You've wanted it since the rent conversation, maybe before. And you're using my mother's fall to try and take it from her legally, because she won't hand it over any other way." Vanessa didn't answer right away, and in the silence, Ryan felt something inside him shift. Not fully toward his mother, not yet, the habits of 4 years of marriage too deep to unravel in a single kitchen confrontation, but enough. Enough to notice, for the first time, that his wife had gone quiet not out of hurt, but out of calculation. He picked the papers back up. "I need to talk to my mother," he said. "Tonight." Arthur Kessler's office hadn't changed much since the last time Maggie had sat across from him. 3 years earlier, in the terrible, fog-thick weeks after Thomas died, when Kessler had walked her through the will with a gentleness she'd never forgotten. The same worn leather chairs. The same shelves of case files organized in a system only he seemed to understand. He'd aged some, silver creeping further into his hair, but his eyes were as sharp as ever when Maggie laid the guardianship petition on his desk, followed by the empty folder from the study drawer. He read the petition first, in silence, his jaw tightening by degrees. "This is baseless," he said finally. "A single hospitalization 8 months ago doesn't establish incapacity, Maggie. Not even close. Any judge who takes a real look at this will see it for what it is." "There's more," Maggie said, and told him about the drawer. The lock that hadn't sat right, the missing copy of the will, the 8-month-old memory of a pen in her hand, and a document she could no longer clearly recall signing. Kessler's expression shifted from irritation into something more focused. "You're sure a copy of the will is missing?" "I keep 2. I've kept 2 since Thomas set it up that way. 1 is gone." He was already turning to his computer, pulling up the firm's records, the same notarized documents he'd filed away 3 years ago. "The original is here, on file with us. That much at least they can't touch." He printed a clean copy and set it beside the petition. And for a moment Maggie let herself breathe a little easier at the sight of Thomas's careful, deliberate language still intact, still hers. Then Kessler paused. "Maggie, this hospitalization. You said there was a document Vanessa had you sign. Do you know what it was?" "I assumed insurance paperwork." I never saw it again after. Do you remember a notary being present? Anyone besides Vanessa and Ryan in the room? Maggie tried to pull the memory forward again, the way she had in the study, and came up against the same soft, medicated blur. I don't know. I don't remember anyone else. Kessler was quiet for a moment, tapping a pen against the edge of his desk, and Maggie recognized the look. The same one he used to get reviewing contracts for Thomas. The look of a man who'd learned, over decades, not to trust a document until he'd held it up to the light himself. I want to see if there's a power of attorney on file anywhere, he said. If Vanessa's petition is built on more than just accusation, I want to know exactly what she's holding. And if there's a signature attached to it. He looked up at Maggie, and something in his face had gone carefully still. I want to compare it to yours myself. Before anyone else does. It took Kessler 4 days to call her back, and Maggie spent every one of them in a state she couldn't quite name. Not fear exactly, not hope either, but the strange suspended feeling of a woman waiting for a verdict she'd already half-guessed. When his office finally called, they asked her to come in person. She understood, before she'd even sat down across from him, that whatever he'd found was worse than she'd let herself imagine. Kessler laid 3 documents on the desk in careful sequence. Like a man building a case, he needed her to see clearly, one piece at a time. The first was the notarized power of attorney, dated 8 months earlier. The same week as her fall, the same hospital room, though Maggie had no memory of a notary ever entering that space. Her name was signed at the bottom in handwriting that looked, at a glance, almost like her own. Almost, Kessler said, watching her study it, is the operative word. He slid her actual signature beside it, from the original will, from a dozen other documents filed over the years. And even without his years of training, Maggie could see it. The slant was wrong. The looping of the M in Margaret closed differently than hers ever had. A careful forgery, done by someone who'd clearly studied her handwriting, but not carefully enough. The notary stamp is the real problem, Kessler continued. I made some calls. The notary listed on this document retired 18 months before this was supposedly signed. Her stamp was reported missing from a real estate office downtown around the same time your fall put you in the hospital. He let that settle before continuing. Someone used a stolen stamp, on a forged signature, to notarize a power of attorney that was never legally granted. The second document was worse. A draft transfer of property, the house, Maggie's house, Thomas's house, prepared using the forged power of attorney as its legal foundation, listing Vanessa Ellison as the party authorized to act on Maggie's behalf in matters concerning real property disposition. It had never been filed, Kessler explained, only prepared, sitting ready in case the guardianship petition succeeded in establishing enough doubt about Maggie's competence to make the transfer look procedurally legitimate. She was building 2 paths to the same door, Kessler said quietly. The petition to make you look incapable. The transfer, ready the moment it succeeded. The third document explained why. It was a loan application, pulled from public financial disclosures Kessler had cross-referenced once he understood what he was looking for. Vanessa's boutique, the one she'd opened 3 years earlier with such confidence, was carrying $85,000 in debt. Unpaid vendor invoices. A defaulted business loan. A second loan application, submitted just 2 months ago, requiring collateral Vanessa did not have. Except on paper, a house she'd been quietly maneuvering to claim as her own. Maggie sat very still, looking at the 3 documents laid out before her like the pieces of a wound she hadn't known was this deep. Not a misunderstanding. Not a daughter-in-law overstepping out of confusion or need. A plan, deliberate, patient, built across months, resting on a forged signature taken from a woman too disoriented on pain medication to notice what her hand had been guided into writing. $85,000, Maggie said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. That we know of, Kessler said. That's what the house was for, Maggie. Not shelter. Collateral. Maggie thought of Thomas's voice in that empty lot 22 years ago. This is where we grow old. She had not imagined, not once in all that time, that growing old here would mean fighting to keep it. Ryan came to Kessler's office alone, at Maggie's request, and she watched her son's face change as Kessler walked him through the documents the same way he'd walked her through them days before. The forged signature, the stolen notary stamp, the loan application with its $85,000 shadow hanging over everything Vanessa had done these past months. He didn't speak for a long time after Kessler finished. He just stared at the copy of the forged power of attorney, his mother's name rendered in handwriting that wasn't hers. And something in his jaw worked the way it used to when he was a boy trying not to cry in front of people. "She did this while Mom was on painkillers," he said finally. Not a question. A fact settling into place. "It appears that way," Kessler said gently. Ryan drove to the house that evening without calling ahead. Maggie didn't go with him. Kessler advised against it, and some part of her, tired in a way that went deeper than the last few weeks, agreed that this conversation needed to happen without her in the room. She heard about it afterward in pieces from Ryan himself, his voice still unsteady hours later. He'd found Vanessa in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd once laid out the rent demand with such careful, rehearsed calm. This time, he said, he didn't sit down. He put the documents on the counter between them and asked her, plainly, to explain the signature. For a moment, she'd tried the same voice she always used. Soft, reasonable. "Ryan, you're not understanding the full situation." But he'd cut her off before she could finish building the sentence. "There's no situation to understand, Vanessa. This is forgery. This is a stolen notary stamp. This is my mother's name written in someone else's hand while she was too drugged to know what she was signing." She'd tried anger next, he said, insisting the debt wasn't her fault, that the boutique had failed because of factors outside her control, that she'd only been trying to protect their future, their family, and didn't he understand how hard she'd worked to build something for them? "You forged a document," Ryan had said, "to steal a house from a grieving widow. That's not building something. That's theft." It was there, he told Maggie later, that her composure had finally cracked. Not into remorse, but into something closer to panic. A woman realizing the ground beneath a carefully constructed plan had given out all at once. She'd grabbed at explanations that didn't hold together, contradicted herself twice within the same breath, and finally, when none of it landed, had gone quiet in a way that felt less like guilt and more like calculation. Already, Ryan suspected, trying to figure out what came next. He hadn't stayed to find out. He'd packed a bag that night and left, standing now in his mother's driveway telling her all of it under a porch light that had burned steadily through every version of this house's history. Through Thomas, through grief, through 22 years of promises that had, in the end, held. The hearing itself was shorter than Maggie had braced for. Kessler had warned her it might be. That once evidence this clear reached a judge, the theater of it tended to collapse quickly. All the careful language of the original petition, unable to survive contact with a forged signature and a stolen notary stamp laid plainly on the record. She sat beside Kessler in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood polish, her hands folded in her lap, and listened as the judge reviewed the documents Kessler had assembled. The handwriting comparison, the notary's confirmed retirement 18 months prior, the missing stamp reported to the county clerk's office around the same time as Maggie's hospitalization. The petitioner's attorney, a young man who looked, Maggie thought, faintly relieved to have this over with, offered little resistance. The guardianship petition was dismissed with prejudice. Not simply denied, closed permanently, barred from being refiled on the same grounds. The judge's tone leaving no ambiguity about how the court regarded what had been attempted. Maggie exhaled a breath she felt she'd been holding for 6 weeks. That was not the end of it, Kessler reminded her gently outside the courthouse. The forged notarization, the stolen stamp, the fraudulent power of attorney. Those weren't simply matters for a family court to dismiss and set aside. They were crimes, documented clearly enough that the district attorney's office had already opened an inquiry once Kessler forwarded the evidence. Within a month, Vanessa was formally charged, forgery, and fraud tied to the falsified notarization. The case built on the same paper trail that had once been meant to take the house quietly, without a fight. Ryan did not go back to her. He'd moved out the night of the confrontation and hadn't returned, staying first with a friend from work and then, as the weeks passed and the reality of the separation settled into something more permanent, finding a small apartment of his own across town. He filed for divorce 2 months after the hearing. Maggie didn't ask him to. She suspected, watching her son move through those weeks with the careful, deliberate steps of someone rebuilding something from close to nothing, that he needed this decision to be entirely his. Proof to himself, as much as to anyone, that he could see clearly now, without anyone guiding his hand. He came by the house most Sundays after that. Pancakes, the newspaper, the particular slowness of a morning with nowhere to be. The same rhythm Maggie had shared with Thomas for 22 years, quietly returning now in a different shape, her son sitting across the table instead of her husband, but the warmth of it unmistakably familiar. "I should have said something sooner," Ryan told her one of those mornings, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "At that first conversation. About the rent. You said something when it mattered," Maggie said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. Outside, the third porch step creaked once, the way it always had, and neither of them moved to fix it. Spring came slowly that year, the way it always did in this part of the country, the oak tree in the backyard budding in careful stages, as though testing whether the cold had truly passed. Maggie stood at the kitchen window one morning in April, watching the light move across the yard, and thought, not for the first time that year, of Thomas standing in an empty lot with a coffee can holding down a stack of blueprints against the wind. This is where we grow old. She had grown old here. She intended to keep doing so, on her own terms, in a house that had nearly slipped through her fingers not because of anything she had failed to do, but because someone had mistaken her quiet stability for vulnerability. She'd spent the winter making sure that mistake could never be made again. Kessler had drawn up the trust over several careful sessions, the two of them working through the language line by line the way he once had with Thomas's will. The house would remain hers for as long as she wanted it. No ambiguity, no vulnerable gap for anyone to exploit through forged paperwork or careful manipulation. And beyond that, it would pass into a protected trust, held for grandchildren who did not exist yet, but who Maggie now allowed herself cautiously to imagine. Kessler agreed to serve as executor, the same steady hand that had unraveled Vanessa's forgery, now safeguarding the house against any future version of the same threat. "No one moves against this again," he told her, sliding the final document across his desk for her signature. Her own handwriting this time, slow and certain, nothing rushed, nothing guided by anyone else's hand. "Not without going through me first." Ryan had taken to fixing small things around the house on his Sunday visits, the way his father used to, the gutters in the fall, a loose hinge on the shed door, though he'd left the creaking third porch step alone without either of them ever discussing why. Some sounds, Maggie thought, were worth keeping. Proof that a house had a history, that it had been walked through and loved and nearly lost and held on to anyway. He'd started dating again, cautiously, months after the divorce finalized, and Maggie found she could hear about it now without the old tightness in her chest. Relief, mostly, that her son had learned to notice the difference between someone who wanted to build something and someone who wanted to take it. On the last warm evening of that April, they sat together on the front porch, the light going gold and slow across the yard the way it had on countless other evenings across 22 years, and Ryan asked her, half joking, if she remembered the color the kitchen used to be before the cream. "Yellow," Maggie said, smiling. "Much too loud. Dad loved it anyway." "He loved most things too loudly," she said. "It was one of his better qualities." The porch step didn't creak, because neither of them moved from where they sat, content, for once, to simply stay.